throughout the whole program, to me, was the struggle within Rob Kardashian. I mean, it seemed like that trial, that whole experience just tore him apart.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was like, seemed like he was just conflicted between his friendship and his duty as an attorney. I mean, because they kind of had to talk him into being a part of the team initially. Apparently, he wasn't even actively licensed or something along those lines. But you could just see over and over again, like, it just tore at him. And I guess part of, you know, he had this friendship with OJ, but they also had friendship with Nicole, and his wife was very close to Nicole. So it just seemed to me, though, like it just tore him apart. And I don't think people as attorneys, people often ask, how can you represent that type?
I was just saying the same thing. Exactly.
I mean, you experience that. You do employment law, and people probably say, you know.
Or an employer may actually mess up and not pay someone correctly or do it in a discriminatory manner. But, you know, they did confirm, he did an interview, he did say it bothered him, this being Rob Kardashian, with the blood evidence. And they did a lot of that on the movie. But I've talked to some criminal defense attorneys, and in their mind it's just like, hey, everyone deserves a right to a fair trial, and it's all about justice. And, and you get that. But, I mean, even me, you know, usually if my client is in the wrong, I'm very quick to be like, listen, we either need to settle this, or you need to recognize some of these weaknesses before we go off parading as if you're completely innocent, and then you get stuck having to defend against something that you originally, you know, didn't take seriously, or, you know, you told a fib about. But, you know, in this instance, that was probably one of the reasons why OJ wasn't going to take the stand, and they convinced him not to take the stand, because you know the weakness of putting him on there, especially if your own team has doubts based on, you know, their friendship with you.
And in addition, they actually put him, at least in the show, and I believe this happened, a polygraph, and they did a mock cross-examination, and he didn't do well in either instance. So it was just like clear cut, no way was he going to even get close to that witness stand.
So we were talking about how a lot of times defense attorneys may have a dilemma or may feel torn when they're representing someone that they either feel is guilty, like Rob Kardashian was a little torn between the two, or if they don't even ask, they just feel like, you know what, this is all about justice, this is all about innocence or proven guilty. But as Black people, since this was such a big racial divide, and a lot of that had to do with the tensions of the time with the Rodney King, did you feel torn between whether or not he was in fact guilty versus whether or not it needs to be some kind of a vindication for what happened with the Rodney King, or for the way police are treating or handling cases brought against Black people, or actively pursuing it against Black people?
Yeah, you know, it was a couple of interesting things about that when I think back on it. Number one, when my friends and family found out that I was working on this, they automatically assumed I was working for OJ and not against him. So sometimes people, even to this day, people will post something on Facebook. He worked with Johnny Cochran. I was like, no, I was actually going against him. So it did bring out this weird dynamic, like I was going against OJ. But,
or against the race.
And hence against the race. But I didn't really feel like that. I just looked at it like it was my client, and I had a duty to the client, and what my personal views on it really didn't matter. It's not like I felt like, you know, I had a client who, say, was guilty of child molestation, and I knew he did it, and I'm sitting here with this incredible moral conflict. And it wasn't really that serious. It was just like, this was a part of the trial. This was evidence. It was kind of an evidentiary issue. It didn't really mean he was guilty or not. You know, whether I bought into the LAPD is crooked. You know, it could be both ways. It could be the LAPD is crooked and they frame people, but that doesn't mean they did it in this case. So I didn't, you know, I mean, I kind of had those things pushed up in my face and from people on the outside, but I didn't really feel those per se. Now, as far as OJ himself and my, sort of my feelings about that racially, I'm a big sports fan, football fan. OJ was, the beginning of his career was a little bit for my time, but I still remember him as on the airplane movies and in the Hertz commercials and all of that. So he was like, and on TV, on the football games, on the sidelines. So he was like this larger than life figure. So for me, it was more of, I can't believe this, kind of sports hero would really do something like this. There's no way he would do something like this. And so what I think what happened is, since he, got tried for this, whether he was ultimately acquitted, but it took away that whole feeling like these guys can't
do wrong,
be responsible. Maybe it's possible that they're just like other people who commit crimes. They just have a lot more money and a lot more fame.
And who knows, the case might have been handled differently if it wasn't a celebrity figure, in terms of how the police may have managed it. But one thing that's interesting that you brought up was the fact that because you weren't exactly, on people's side or OJ's side, you didn't quite feel like you had to pick a side. But at least from my understanding with the tapings that you were involved with, some of those tapings had some, very negative racial slurs against this officer that obviously the defense used to show some type of racial bias in terms of their investigation. So when you're trying to get the tapes from being brought into evidence, did you feel torn as someone that was like, listen, we need to have this, and this shows at least some type of bias when it comes to the handling of the case? Somewhat, because we knew that where the testimony with Mark Furman was left, that he testified he never used the N-word, for example, and so you have direct contradictory evidence, and so there is that feeling like, well, maybe the jury should decide what the value of this evidence is, but I couldn't let that get in the way of what your duty is, to your client. And again, we're part of a team, so it's not like, and I'm like the lowest member of this team, so let's just get that straight. So it's not like, I feel like, oh, I'm directly responsible for this getting in or not getting in. But if I had been her sole attorney, I still would have taken the same approach, and I still would have fought just as hard for her, because it's not my job to get OJ acquitted or convicted. It's my job to represent my client. And if she doesn't want to go, she doesn't want to participate, and she doesn't want to lose her materials, then that's my job, is to protect her interests. Yeah, which is interesting. It's almost another segment, that line between protecting my client or representing my client versus seeking justice and truth and all that.